morning, everybody. Morning. My pleasure here to welcome everybody to this morning's program. My name is Benjamin Neely. I'm the Executive Director of the Berks History Center, and I'm so glad to see you here this morning. I just have a few announcements before we get started. There's some upcoming programs that I think you might enjoy. April 27th at 9 a.m. we have a water pitcher basket workshop. So it's with our education curator, Vicki, who's coming out of the kitchen now. If you have any questions about it, but it's a modern style basket. Vicki teaches all sorts of different styles of basket across history, but this is a modern style in the shape of a water pitcher. Just a neat way to store your dried flowers. On May 4th, Vicki is leading Ole Valley Barn Tour with Greg Huber, who is an amazing wealth of knowledge on our local barns here in Berks County. There's actually two sessions. So there's going to be one from 8 to noon and one from 1 to 5. And so there's more details on our website. Also on May 4th here at 10 a.m. with our museum curator, Amber Vroman. She is teaching a Scherenschnitte workshop, which is difficult to pronounce for me. It is also a centuries-old German paper cutting technique that creates like a lace effect, if you're not familiar with it, but it really is very neat. Amber's a great teacher for that, and I think you'd enjoy it joining her for that. Next month's second Saturday, right back here on May 11th at 10 o'clock, the topic is going to be European villages of origin for Berks County, early Berks County immigrant families. And this will be presented by Evans Goodling, who's a walking textbook. I think you'd enjoy his program as well. We have more programs listed on our website, and I see some member badges. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. There's special pricing for members. So if you're not, we'd love to have you. And you'd also can begin to enjoy our quarterly magazine, the Historical Review of Berks County. And if you're a history buff, you will love this magazine. So if we can sign you up today out in the lobby, we can help you do that. You can go to our website and do it right on your phone right after this program. You need to pay attention. But it's berkshistory.org. And we always post new events and ongoing happenings that come along, unexpectedly that we take advantage of, and we'll use our social media for that. So if you follow us on Facebook or Instagram, you will get all the latest information. So we hope that we'll continue to see future programs. And now we are ready for the main event. So we are joined by Paul Druzba here today. We have our friends Muhlenberg Green Architects have also set up a display here. Thank you very much, Suzanne. And we're also joined by some special guests. I hope you don't mind me embarrassing you a little bit to push out, but we have some descendants of John Rigg here with us today. So I think that's very special. Thank you very much for coming to join us this morning. We'll save our questions for the end of the program. We have some folks joining us remotely as well. So for the folks that are at home, if you put your questions or comments in the comment field, we will check them at the end of the program. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to the very capable Paul Druzba.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to see you all here this morning. Is there anyone here today who was at the walk over at the cemetery last week? All right, we have a few. Okay. Well, just for the sake of those people, I'm going to put my hat back on. Maybe you'll recognize me now. I was John Rigg over at the cemetery tour last week. So that was a lot of fun. But the hat will stay away for now. Okay, this is my fourth book that I've written about local history. And it really is a thrill to see so many members of the Rigg family here today. I think I'm going to learn a few things before I go home. At any rate, it's one of those things that kept popping up in some of my previous books, especially the one on Carsonia Park. It had John's picture in there, and I really just started to get interested in him when I put that together. And I thought, this guy's really interesting, and that turned into a book too. You have to be careful. But at any rate, I guess we'll get started. Okay. It doesn't want to go. The advancer is not working.
Oh, is the clicker turned on?
I don't know. It's just a picture on here. Oh,
There you go.
and it's going to work from
It
here.
should work from now on.
Wonderful. Okay. Fortunately, I'm better at writing than I am at technology. We're going to go back a little ways today to 1854, which is a long way.
You have an arrow on.
I don't know how to get rid of the arrow. There's another arrow on the bottom, but this is it. Well, at any rate, just ignore that arrow in the middle. In 1854, the American flag looked a bit different than it does now. There were only 31 stars on that. Franklin Pierce was the president then, not one of our best known presidents. The office of the vice president was vacant. Not meaning that the vice president was vacant, but that the office was vacant. The Civil War was still 7 years in the future in 1854. And some of the notables who were born in 1854, John Philip Sousa, who died right here in Reading, not the same year. C.W. Post, the serial inventor. George Eastman, the photographic inventor. And that takes care of the well-known people. The unknown people include John Rigg. It's funny because in 1900, John Rigg was probably one of the best known people in Berks County. Everybody knew who John Rigg was. But these days, when people would ask me after the Carsonia book, what are you working on now? I'd say, well, I'm working on a biography of John Rigg. And they would say, who? Nobody knows him now. And it's partly because one of his biggest achievements was the trolley system in Berks County, which is gone now. But he also was the founder of Metropolitan Electric, which turned into MedEd. I did a program at the MedEd retirees a few years back after the Carsonia Park book came out. And his picture came up on the show, and I said, you guys recognize this man? And they said, well, he founded your company. Oh, really? They had no idea. So, in 100 years, poor John has become unknown, but back in those days, he was anything but. John was born in this building, which was kind of a boarding house back in 1854, one of the oldest buildings in Gibraltar, which isn't that far from here. Despite the fact that he was born in Reading, he wasn't here very long. I think John was kind of like the last straw financially in the Rigg family at the time. They were kind of struggling. His father was a butcher in Reading. His mother was the daughter of a farmer out in Carnarvon Township. But they were living here when John was born. But at that point, it was like, we can't do this anymore. And so they packed up and moved the whole clan, John and his older brother and his older sister and everybody else, and went out to Carnarvon Township, back to the farm. The farmer's name was Adam Steyer, and his daughter's name was Catherine. And it was kind of a weird situation when they got back there, because the Riggs were poor. They really didn't have that much to offer financially. The kids were all young, so they weren't of much use on the farm. And Mr. Rigg was a butcher in Reading, so what was he going to do? And that left Catherine, who became kind of a housekeeper. They kind of had her down as a housekeeper in one of the census forms. So they were down there for a number of years. This is the farm circled in Carnarvon Township. Just for the record, there are two Carnarvon Townships. There's the one that you see here in Lancaster County, and just to the right, over in Berks County, it says on the map, that is the Berks County version. And so the Steyer farm was just barely in Carnarvon Township. This is a photograph of the farm in the old days. The old days meaning when John Rigg was a boy. John Rigg grew up on this farm until he was about, he was here till he was 15. He went to school in this building. The one on the left is the building pretty much the way it looked when John went to school there. It's the California School, named after the road that it's on, California Road. And the building on the right is how it appears now. And the building was demolished a number of years ago, and this building popped up in its place. It was pretty much built right over the foundation of the old one. And it looks a bit different, but that's the spot. John went to school here. He only started school when he was 12, and he gave it up when he was 15. So he wasn't what you would call a well-educated man. He always said that I learned how to work before I could count. But in any case, he just decided he was never going to get rich working on a farm. And so when he was 15 in the summer, one day, he packed up an extra shirt and a pair of shoes in his little kit bag. And he started walking to Reading in his bare feet. 17 miles. That's a long way. And on the way, when he was just getting away from his farm, he met a friend of his on the way, and a friend said, "Where are you going, John?" And he said, I'm going off to be a millionaire." Yeah, right. And darn if he didn't. And when John got to Reading, one of the first places that he would have seen was this place, which is the canal right along 6th Street. This is not too far from the bridge. There was a bridge that went over the Schuylkill River. At that time, there was only one bridge over the Schuylkill, and that was the Lancaster Bridge, now known as the Bingham Street Bridge. But in those days, there was no Penn Street Bridge. The old wooden one had been demolished in a flood, and they hadn't gotten around to building the new one yet. So he only had one choice of how to get into Reading. Now, while John was there, he worked a number of odd jobs. Probably the most important, and the one that never showed up in any of the histories that I read about John, and there weren't that many of those, was that he worked for a while. I'm going to go back here for a minute. He worked for a while on this canal. I have no absolute proof of that, except for one thing. There was a guy there, Augustus Baum, who was a boatman on the canal. And he, for some reason, ran into John when he first showed up in town. And John got to know Augustus's daughter, a pretty 17-year-old girl named Sally. And they got married pretty quickly. After, even though John skipped around to various jobs when he was here, he ended up living with the Baums for a while on South 3rd Street near the canal. And it was not long after that that he ran into the guy who started up this new business, this new horse car business called the City Passenger Railway. And this lucky horse car had, looks like 3 horses or 4 horses on it. Most cars had 2 or maybe even 1 horse that was pulling them. And this car is shown out North 6th Street out this way, not far from where we are right now. A couple of things about horses. There were thousands of horses being used in Reading at the time. Now, each horse produces 15 to 30 pounds of manure. I don't mean to mess up your breakfast here, but and gallons of urine. So the city, I mean, frankly, the city stank. And you had to be careful crossing the street here. But, you know, horses were good on the other hand. I mean, you had to feed them. They were the biggest expense in running the company. They had to be fed, they had to be shoed, they had to be put up in a barn, in a stable overnight. So, you know, whenever people say, I wish we could go back to the good old days. Maybe not. Now, the engine on a horse-drawn vehicle, the horse, had a mind of its own. Sometimes they'd kick, bite, trample bystanders. Horses would sometimes drop dead from exhaustion if they were worked too hard. They love to eat no matter where they are. And they would be willing to stop anywhere, anytime for a quick bite. So they had their disadvantages. John Rigg got a job on the horse car line, the 6th Street line that went from the river all the way out to the big train station out on 6th Street. And he worked on there for a number of years. He started to buy houses. And it's kind of interesting about the first 4 or 5 houses that he bought were all along 6th Street. Out of sight, out of mind. And you know, if he was going to be working on the line, he might as well live there too. So, you know, that went really well. And eventually he went from conductor, which is the guy in the back of the car who takes the money, to the driver in the front who actually ran the horses. And then a few months later, he became the superintendent of the line. And he started acquiring other companies. There was another Penn Street line that ran up, which he acquired a few years later. And suddenly he had a little empire going. He was making really, really good money by this time. And this picture shows actually his private car. This was, and it was called the United. This obviously happened after 1893, which is when the electric trolley started to run. They finally got permission from Reading City Council to electrify the trolley system. And this car was used by John and staff members to inspect the lines. It was very important to keep everything in good operating condition, especially the rails. At the end of one of the lines that went up Perkiomen Avenue in Reading, there was a car barn up there that 19th and let's call it Forest Street. And the building to the right says United. It's a little small, but it says United Traction Company. And by this time, the acquisitions were starting to happen. It wasn't any longer the City Passenger Railway or the Perkiomen Avenue Railway. It was now the United Traction Company. And it just kept on like that throughout his career. But this is where the cars were stored at night and when they weren't being used or if they needed repair. And when around the time right near that car barn, which you can't, you can see it at the very top right, traction car barn. Right in front of that was Miller's Hotel. There was a hotel, like a resort hotel that was there. And they had a dance hall and a hotel. It was very nice. And the line that you see on the bottom, the Reading and Southwestern, came up Forest Street. And I made note of this, and it also stopped at the car barn. That railway was the only one that really stood in Rigg's way for a long, long time in his acquisition quest in Reading. They were really stubborn. And when they finally did let go of the reins, they made a deal with Mr. Rigg that he could take over the company, but if he ever let it go, if he ever stopped running it, he would have to pay a fine of $50,000. Now, John was nothing if not cheap, and he was not about to let that happen. So it's interesting that many, many years later, in 1952, when the last trolley ran in Reading, it was a Reading and Southwestern car, and it was still there because the company would not pay the fine. Finally, it ended up in court, and the court said, okay, this has been going on long enough, and they waived the fine, and that's when, like the next day, the last car ran, and it was so popular that they had to run two cars out the mountain from downtown Reading. Now, one of John's better achievements in life was the founding of Carsonia Park, which was a trolley park. Trolley parks were a common thing in the 1890s when trolley companies were looking for ways to make more money. They were selling lots of trolley tickets to people who worked and were driving or riding the trolley to work, but they didn't have many customers in the evening and also on weekends. And so to fix that, trolley companies, including this one, United Traction Company, would buy up land on the outskirts of town, and they would form a park there. They'd run some track out to it and start a park. And that's what Mr. Rigg did. He bought about 150 acres from the Schweitzer family in Pennside. And they started building the park in 1896, which, as it turns out, was the year that his mother died. But the picture on the right shows some trolley cars that came down. Track was run down Carsonia Avenue and from Mount Penn. And they would stop at a building right in front of the park on Carsonia Avenue. And that's where all the arcade stuff was, inside this building. That's the stuff that separates you from your pennies. And they had the little things that you would crank to watch the girly show, in the little viewer. And when it would get a little spicy, you could tell because it would slow down. Eventually that moved into the park, but this is where it was at the beginning. One of the first amusements, let's call it, at the park was this carousel. And this was steam powered, as you can see on the far right there. And there were horses and some other things that you could sit on that would go around in the circle. But there were also, on the early versions, there were some chairs, just like the ones that you're sitting on now. And so there would be some of these chairs on this round turntable, and the stinky engine would start up, and you'd go around in this chair. And people paid a dime to go around this wooden thing in a chair. They were easily amused in 1897. This lasted for, maybe 5 years. And like most things, it got a little old, and they decided to replace it with a proper carousel, which in those days cost about $15,000. Now, if you want one of the originals from those days, it'll cost you 5 to 10 million. So they went up just a bit. The picture on the left shows an assistant would have worn this, and every year the trolley company, the traction company, would put on the Strawberry Festival at Carsonia Park, and this was a fundraiser for the Trolleymen's Association. There was no retirement in those days, no Social Security, and so, you know, whatever you made during your life, that better do it, you know, because you were on your own when you couldn't work anymore. So all of the money from that day at Carsonia Park would go into the Trolleymen's Fund. And in addition to that, Mr. Rigg matched it. So it was a very good day for the trolleymen. In the background, you can see Carsonia Park Lake, and which at one time was called Crystal Lake. Everything was called Crystal in those days. There's a little crystal lake up on Neversink that's about 6 feet wide, you know, and you know, the idea was to show that it was clean. But you can see the shoot-the-chutes in the background there that used to empty into this lake, and you can see the roller coaster in the background as well. So this is John when he was about 40 years old. This is actually my favorite picture of him, and he was my model for my mustache for the program last week. And the same year that the park opened, that's when his mother, Catherine, died. She kind of followed him into Reading. It may seem a little unusual that a 15-year-old boy would just up and leave and walk 17 miles into a big city. But she wasn't real happy with the conditions at the farm either. And she followed him in before long. It's hard to say exactly when. And over the years, he fixed her up with 3 or 4 different houses along 6th Street, always right along 6th Street. And so he was never far away, but he was close to her in a way, but in another way, he never actually lived in the same house with her. You know, I'm sure there are probably some reasons for that, but, you know, I don't want to go there. This is a picture that my friend Jim in the front row passed along to me a few years ago. It's actually a Christmas card that was produced by the men who ran the trolley in Wilkes-Barre. And every one of them signed it, and they sent it to him. And it was because he was such a good employee. They really liked him. Not so much the guys in Reading. He liked Reading. He really loved Reading, and this is where he got his start. But because of some labor unrest later on, his relationship with the workers in Reading kind of cooled a little bit, but it remained strong in Wilkes-Barre. In 1901, it was the first strike that Mr. Rigg ever encountered. This was something new, and he had no experience with this. The pictures are from the Philadelphia Inquirer, because in those days, the Reading Eagle didn't have pictures. It was still a pretty simple paper. The best you could get in the Eagle was a line drawing of something, but these were actual photographs of the strike. And Mr. Rigg handled the strike the only way he really knew how. He dug in his heels and said, "No." And that was it. It lasted for about 3 days. I think they were surprised by his reaction, and they gave up. So it worked this time. Now, about 7 years later, there was another strike in Chester. And this picture shows, again, this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it shows some people kind of gathered around looking like they're going to make trouble. Let's go back to that for a minute. There were cars down in Chester that were blown up. It was ugly. The strike lasted for about 6 months. And yet Mr. Rigg handled it pretty much the same way he did the first one. He said, no. And he just dug in his heels and would not give in. They must have lost a lot of money in this strike, the trolley company, that is, because the trolleys just weren't running. And but I think he made a remark at one point, and he said something like, I have $1 million to make sure that this strike does not succeed. Okay. Well, if he had that much money, he could have paid the extra 2 cents an hour that the employees were asking for, but he was a little stubborn. This one worked also. They really, at the end of 6 months, they really didn't have anything more than they started out with. Now there's somebody who brought in a picture at the beginning of the program today. It's a long picture, and this is a part of it. On the far left, you can see Mr. Rigg. This is at the old farm, the old Steyer farm. And Mr. Rigg is, if you think I'm a little wide in the middle, he was, two things. Mr. Rigg loved to eat, number one. And the other thing is he loved beer. And so he spent a lot of time at the farm. And whenever he would come back into Reading to work, he would always stop along the way at least once for a beer, and ditto on the way home. And so by the time Mr. Rigg became an older man, he weighed well over 300 pounds. Now he was also very patriotic, a Republican, of course, as many business people are. And he had the house all decorated for a special patriotic occasion, and invited all of his friends over, probably a lot of neighbors from down at the farms too. In 1896, he bought the farm in a manner of speaking. He bought the old Steyer farm, which was about 83 acres, I think, at the time. And he started adding on to it. Until he was finished, there was over 500 acres. He just loved that place. And he started to pump money into it. This is the cow barn after he started putting money in it. And he had a special air filtration system in here, which was kind of an early form of air conditioning. The cows were very comfortable in this place. There were also some concrete pillars there. John loved concrete, and these are very reminiscent of the pillars that were outside of Carsonia Park in 1896 when he built that. But it also shows an electric lamp in the front, which is something that was never at the farm before John got it. And he invested millions of dollars into the farm, including pumping spring water in from over a mile away. Now, this was taken probably about 1905 or so. At that point, the old private car went by the wayside, and this was replaced by this one. By the way, if there are any trolley fans in the group, this car is an example of a double truck car. It's got two trucks underneath. A truck is a group of wheels, and the early trolley cars had one truck in the middle. And most companies found pretty quickly that the best financial decision was to make the cars bigger. You could put more people on the cars, but the trouble is with that one truck in the middle, if you made the car bigger, it became very unstable. And especially teenagers love to get on the back of those things and rock it. And they actually knock the cars off of the tracks that way. And teenagers never change. So, as the cars got bigger, the double trucks made more sense. And this shows the inside also of the new private car. you could, there's room for lots of people in here, but only the way the seating was before with the benches. Now they had individual chairs in here, wicker chairs. In the 1890s, one of the things that Mr. Rigg realized was that one of the expenses for the cars was electric. And if we control the electric company, we can control the price of the electric. So the first thing he did was he bought, on the right, you can see the power plant from the Neversink Mountain Railroad. Another thing that brought me to where I am now with Mr. Rigg. And this wasn't working properly. It needed to be updated. And he bought it and put the extra dynamos in there and got it to the point where the cars could actually go up the mountain. And when he bought that, he created a new company called the Metropolitan Electric Company. Now, the building on the left was originally the Reading Electric Company, and they powered many of the trolleys in Reading. And he would be, in the early days, he would have been buying his electric from them, but he bought out the company. And so now he owned both of these things. And about 20 years later, the word Edison was named, added into the name, and it became Metropolitan Edison, or Med-Ed. But in the early days, it was just Metropolitan. Somebody was asking before the program, you know, where the power plant was in West Reading. And I really didn't know until I went down there and started snooping around. And I came down the street. This is Franklin Street and intersects with First. Franklin is the one I couldn't remember. And I thought, well, that looks about the right size. And right across the street, across Franklin, there's a business in there, Rick's Printing. And I went in there, and the guy who runs it came out, and he was very nice. And I said, any idea what that building was across the street? And he said, well, back in the 80s, I think they used to sell pumps or something from there. And I said, no, I'm talking about like 100 years ago. He said, oh, I don't. But if you look at the top of the building, you can see electric insulators up there all along the top of it. And that was the tip off. That's when I realized that this was the new power plant in West Reading, that they spent a few $1 million in 1911 to build. I took these pictures right after, maybe about a month or so after the explosion at the Palmer Candy Factory. And what you see is all the rubble from the explosion on the side. All the building in the background is all the old electric company. Now, if you drive through there, all the rubble is gone. It's all been cleaned up, but I got there just at the right or wrong time. Now, there are some pictures here from 1911 that I acquired on eBay. I don't know if they didn't know what it was or what, but there are 10 or 11 different pictures that were photographed in that time. And they're all of the power plant in West Reading, including, excuse me, including some pictures of the basketball team that they had. They had their own basketball team. When I went there the first time, we went up the back, and there's a belt line, railroad belt line that runs down the back of the building. And there's no remnants of that thing that you see on the left here anymore. All the supports are gone now, but they used to run coal down a belt directly into the plant. And on the right is the coal crew. It says right there, coal crew. Now, on this picture, which is the Bingerman Street Bridge or Lancaster Bridge, over on the left, you see some trolley tracks that kind of veer off to the left. Those tracks actually went over to the electric plant. And what they used to do is when they burned up the coal and it became cinders, they would load it onto trolley cars dump cars, they called them. And they would bring it out to here and then head down to Carsonia Park. And all the cinders were dumped at Carsonia Park. And there was kind of a mini Centralia fire going on for a while down there from these cinders, because sometimes they don't burn all the way. This is one of those dump cars that would come down, and that's specifically what it was designed for, just to haul ash from the power plant. This is the old Penn Street Bridge, which is the steel one. That was the second Penn Street Bridge. And it's giving way to the new plant. In the foreground, you can see the pillars from the new plant going up, or the new bridge going up. So the new one would have been constructed first, and then the old one would have been trashed. When they built the power plant, by the way, one of the biggest holdups in it was trying to run the electric lines over into Reading. They actually had to run them under the river. And the state government was not real crazy about that idea. And it took them a while to convince them that they weren't going to kill everybody. Later on, this is the house more or less that Rigg bought. This was about his 6th or 7th house. One of the books that I based my story on was called Riggy, and it was a book that was produced by Mr. Moeller here in the front, and a few others, about his grandmother. Your mother, I'm sorry. Riggy was a granddaughter of John Rigg. John had 2 sons, Walter and Samuel, and Riggy was Samuel's daughter. But they grew up in this house, and I think the part of the title of the book was The Journey from 5th Street. And so this would have been all that they would have remembered of childhood, was the 5th Street house. They wouldn't have remembered the houses that their fathers grew up in, which is Chestnut Street and all the places along 6th Street. But in 1897, when he bought this place, it didn't look anything like this. This picture is actually from a 1925 renovation of the building, which was done by the Muhlenberg architect people that are here today. And there are some plans from it over here on the table. So please be sure to check those out, before you leave today. The Muhlenberg people were very generous in opening up their files to me, and I got some really nice pictures for the book from that. But when this building was first bought by Mr. Rigg, the center section of it wasn't there. There was a house on both sides, and he lived in the house on the right of this picture. The middle section was blank, and there was somebody else, I guess, living in the other side. Eventually, he bought up all 3. And in 1925, it was actually his son, Walter, that initiated the renovations of the building, which in those days were supposedly about $50,000 or $60,000. In today's money, that would be $2 or $3 million for the renovation. So he did have a few bucks when he retired. These are John's sons. On the left is Walter, and in his younger days. He doesn't have quite the mustache that I do, or that John had. The guy on the right is Samuel. That's Riggy's father. They both were medical doctors, by the way. And when John passed away in 1926 in Philadelphia, his son Walter signed the death certificate. These are the girls. And there's Riggy on the left, and Catherine, who was Walter's daughter, on the right, and in the middle is Sally, John's wife. This is a picture that was taken later in John's life, when he started to spread out a little bit. He still had the mustache, but like mine, the mustache started to go white. Now, 1914 or 15, Mr. Rigg started to build, and by that time he was what you might call filthy rich. He started to build a bungalow, which most of us would call a mansion, in Carnarvon Township at the old farm. Right at the top of the hill where he grew up at, he built this house at the top of the hill. There was a house and also a garage off to the side of it, which is here somewhere. These are the guys who built the house. The guy on the left, there are about 2 or 3 different pictures that were taken of these guys. And the guy on the left refused to look at the camera. Actually, John was a lot like that too. He wasn't real crazy about cameras either. And when I first started working on the Parsonia book, I had trouble finding even one picture of him. I mean, he did not like a lot of publicity. He was kind of shy in a way. As far as public speaking was concerned, there were a lot of occasions where he would be given a banquet or, you know, something special. And he always left it up to Mr. Jones, his lawyer, to do the talking, because John's voice was very high. He had a very high voice, and he was he realized that he didn't sound that good, you know, in speaking, so he would always leave it to somebody else. Plus, he would be overcome by a lot of the generosity of his employees. The house is on the right and the garage is on the left. At the time, it was $150,000. That's about $3 million today. And at that time, a lot of the, I don't want to refer to Mr. Rigg as a robber baron, but, you know, there were a lot of robber barons around in those days. And it was typical of them to build these palaces and call them bungalows or cottages, you know, to make it sound like, well, this isn't really a big deal, you know. And if you ever go up to, we've been to a couple of bus trips from the Berks History Center up to upstate New York. And, you know, you go to see the houses from the Vanderbilts and things like that. And those were cottages. This is inside the mansion or cottage. This is one of the get-together rooms. And when I did a program recently down there, and it was done in this room. And the windows are really kind of interesting in a way, because they refer to things that were important to Mr. Rigg. They represented something important to him. Unfortunately, we have no idea what they are, because nobody wrote those down, and nobody remembers that I know of, unless somebody here does today. But there are maybe 10 or 12 windows like this scattered around the house, and I wish I knew what they meant. There were a lot of conveniences here. Over on the left is something that Rigg swore off when he first started to upgrade the farm, which is a telephone. He didn't want any parts of those. But, you know, by the time the teens rolled around, the 19-teens, he changed his mind, at least in terms of the farm. And this phone connected him with different places around the farm, like the cow barn and things like that. So he could keep tabs on what was going on down on the farm just from there. The gizmo on the right, which was built in Reading, was the alarm system, I guess you could call it. Whenever Mr. Rigg needed something and he was upstairs in his room, he would just press a button. And wherever he was, the arrow for that on this thing would flip up and the bell would ring. And then the servants would, you know, be able to respond and come up and help him with what he needed. He had a number of servants over the years. It seems when he was at the mansion, there were probably 5 or 6 people at least that were working down there. When he was in Reading, he had a number of them on Fifth Street. There were, over the years, most of them were white, although towards the end, he had several black servants in the house too. There was this is a dumbwaiter. And so if Mr. Rigg needed a meal, this started out downstairs in the kitchen annex, and the meal could be put in here and sent upstairs. This was John's room. And when you look out the window, you don't see a whole lot. I mean, there are trees and stuff, and you can barely tell that the farm is down the hill. And I think that was probably one of his regrets when he built the place, was that he didn't have much of a view from his bedroom window. So he fixed that. This was, yes.
That radiator is an original radiator under the window.
I have no reason to suspect it isn't. As far as I know, everything in this building is original, except for one room. There's a bathroom upstairs. And this was used actually as a retirement home, the actual building, for a while. And so they had to renovate the bathroom upstairs, I guess, to just keep it up to code. But as far as I know, everything else in the house is original from 1915. This is the shower. You don't see these anymore. And it was a nice wide, the pipes were nice and wide up at the top to accommodate the nice wide John. Another one of those windows that, that he designed. Now, I talked about the view, and after a while, when he realized that the view was pretty lousy from his window, he had this built. It's a little tower, all wood, I guess, except for the roof, and he has a nice big wide rocking chair up there, and he could climb up there and sit there and look down on his farm, and he loved that place. The only thing left of it now is the concrete pad that supported it when he had it built. These are some of the, I think that's Riggy on the left, but the other people I'm not sure about. And they're tending a garden, a little garden that used to be out front, but it's not anymore. It's kind of interesting that the building really closely resembles the building that he was born in Gibraltar. It looks very much the same, from the striped awnings, down to those pillars in the front. There are 5 pillars on this building, and there were 4 on the garage, which was almost identical. In the 1930s, the building was, well, the building was left to Walter, his son, and the farm was left to Samuel. And so Walter's daughter, Catherine, would have done all the, paperwork in the 1930s, because Walter was a doctor, and, he worked in Reading, and he needed somebody else to do some of his paperwork for him. So in the 1930s, the building was sold to the Zerby sisters, which was kind of a group of country and Western singers. And you can see them here. I guess they were looking for something to retire to, that, because you can't be a performer forever. But this is a picture that I took of the building when I first visited it a couple of years ago. And this is a sketch of the building that was done by the Muhlenberg people. At first it was Muhlenberg. Later on it became Muhlenberg Green, but at the time when this work was done, it was Muhlenberg Architects. And this was done in 1925. I have never seen a picture of the front of this building before the renovation. I have a photograph that I took from behind the building. I kind of snuck through a garage that's back there now and looked over a fence and I took a picture. And you can see how it's laid out. You know, you can see that the middle section just wasn't there at one time. But I've never seen that same view from the front. And while that renovation was taking place, this is a building on 4th Street in Reading, which is almost all the way up to the Reading Eagle Company at Fort. And there's a sign over it, I think it says Bloom Furniture now. At any rate, Mr. Rigg took an apartment here while the renovation was going on in 1925. Here are a couple of pictures of him around the farm. The one on the left is Frank Henderson, who was his valet. The people on the right, the only one we're sure of is Catherine. She's the one on the that's kind of sitting down and with a big toothy grin. The other two women, nobody seems to know who they are. But as you can see, John was really filling out a pair of pants in those days. This is a picture that I got from Jim. This is Rigg later in life. I'm guessing he was well into his 60s when this portrait was done. And every winter, John and sometimes his wife would live in Philadelphia. They had a suite of rooms at the Longacre Hotel, which is one of the great mysteries of Philadelphia. Every hotel in Philadelphia had a postcard of it in those days, except for the Longacre. There is no postcard picture of the Longacre, and I have not seen a picture of the hotel as it existed in those days. The building is more or less still there, but it's lots of different things now. But at any rate, in 1926, when New Year's Day came around, Mr. Rigg was down in his hotel in Philadelphia, and he had a stroke on New Year's Day. And they took him to the hospital, and he died the next day in the hospital. And it's funny, and this is me last week doing my Rigg impression over at the cemetery. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, Rigg's death certificate was signed by his son, Walter, who of course was a medical doctor. And both of his sons were with him when he passed away. So this is the end of the story. But unfortunately, the legacy that he had built up over the years pretty much disappeared after he did. The trolley system really started to vanish in the 1920s, right after he died. And the only reason it hung on along so far in Reading was because of that goofy contract, you know, for $50,000. But if it weren't for that, the trolleys would have stopped running in Reading at least 10 years before that. So, you know, between that and the fact that nobody from MedEd had any idea who he was, you know, nowadays people say, who? But in 1900, they did not. Everybody knew him then.